I mean, academic freedom and free speech, yes, like those are important things, but I think we need to understand the attack on universities as something that's happening within the context that I described like about 15 minutes ago in our recording. That there is a very remarkable and what I see as something that has been incredibly successful shift, ideological and cultural shifts, um, both within and possibly outside of the United States. Um, and this is like the culture war that the right wing is always talking about. And so a lot of that obviously comes from people who are spend their lives thinking, are like experts of thought, like professors, right? And intellectuals. And students, right? People who are learning the truth, the truth of imperialism, who use terms like imperialism or capitalism or white supremacy or heteropatriarchy. And so, anyway, the assault you're seeing on universities has a lot to do with a very concerted effort that has been going on for a long time, actually. It's not just the right, um, to completely disempower and to dismantle those fields and disciplines of intellectual inquiry that you would typically find leftists, right? You'd typically find Marxists, you typically find feminists, you typically find like LGBTQ2 folks, people who specialize in queer politics, right? People who are very critical of race, racial capitalism. So at the University of Minnesota, where I'm at, for example, it's the College of Liberal Arts, and it's like specifically, it's very certain programs. It's like comparative lit. It's like African and African American studies. It's gender, women, and sexuality studies. It's American Indian studies. It's like Chicano and Latino studies. Like these are the departments that are going to be that are like at the forefront of these various investigations against so quote unquote anti-Semitism at universities, because these are the spaces that have had the most profound impact, I think, on shifting that kind of cultural and ideological understanding of American history or American empire, for example. And I've also seen like really, really good, I mean, just people must be working their asses off in the AAUP, the American Association of University Professors, as well as the various like educators for justice in Palestine or faculty for justice in Palestine chapters that are on campuses across the United States. Um, because they've been providing such a good analysis also of what's happening. And this term anti-Semitism, I mean, it's a real thing, right? But the way that it's being weaponized is really widely understood as just a cloak for repression, given the fact, right, that you're saying that like the Trump administration is so white supremacist, like they're so intensely anti-Semitic and racist, right? And is racist against everyone, right? But it's a joke. It's just a joke to claim that this task force is about combating or like neutralizing anti-Semitism, because that's obviously not what it's about at all. It's just you can just get a lot of like political brownie points, I think, in this moment. It's also funny because these letters, like the letter I read for Harvard, they're talking about how ideological capture is the term that they use. So the federal government is basically what President Garber at Harvard refused to do were to comply with several points that were made in an April 11th, 2025 letter from the Trump administration to Harvard. And one of the things that the federal government stipulated, or the language that they used, was like combating ideological capture. So those departments like mine, American Indian Studies, I'm assuming at the University of Minnesota Twin Cities, would be considered to be a highly ideological, i.e., like lacking diverse viewpoints from like the Trump administration's perspective. They call them reforms, right? That the federal government is demanding. There's their bullet points in this letter. But one of them, right, is essentially like monitoring, and the federal government having broad authority and discretion to monitor and to intervene into all kinds of things like hiring of faculty, the admissions of students, student groups, right? If a student group wants to form and go through the approval process, auditing certain departments and units. And if they are deemed by an external reviewer that has been approved essentially by the federal government that is favorable, the federal government finds favorable that if an audit has been performed, for example, on my department at the University of Minnesota, to be lacking ideological diversity and being rife with ideological capture, then the university agrees to and is required to hire new people in that department to provide quote unquote diversity, ideological diversity, and or specifically target students who will bring in quote unquote ideological diversity into those units. I think what is most there's a lot of people have focused, of course, on like the attack on DEI in these, but I'm actually shocked that like news hasn't focused more on the fact that this what's most concerning to me about what I see in this letter is how the federal government is granting itself an enormous amount of power in what you can say, right? Like what you can say, who is allowed to be in spaces, faculty, students, staff, and administrators at these institutions, what is allowed to be taught, what is allowed to be spoken about, if you are even allowed to be a department moving forward. Because one of the recommendations that they make is that if a department cannot be reformed, I'm using scare quotes, cannot be reformed after this external audit has been reviewed and approved by the federal government as to whether or not a particular department or unit has quote unquote ideological diversity, of course, which is defined by and determined by the federal government. If they cannot hire more faculty, then that unit will be absorbed into, I think, a cognate something. What did they say? They'll be absorbed into another department, meaning those departments will be completely dissolved. So imagine if every American Indian Studies program in the United States underwent an audit of this nature. Not just mine, because the University of Minnesota Twin Cities is on this list of institutions that the DOJ task force is coming after. That would essentially destroy the entire field of Native American and Indigenous studies. The entire field. And I guarantee that most of like the gender and sexuality studies departments would fail the audit. I'm just going to predict this. Most of the quote unquote ethnic studies departments would fail the audit. I think some history departments would fail these audits. And so pretty much all of the liberal arts, most of the liberal arts departments would fail these audits, and they would be absorbed into probably what would be newly created departments that are meaningless, but also highly regulated. This also provides a lot of measures, again, very open-ended language about sanctioning and punishing faculty in units that have quote unquote that the report of the external party for like some of these audits shall include information as to individual faculty members who discriminated against Jewish or Israeli students or incited students to violate enter university's rules following October 7th. And the university and federal government will cooperate to determine appropriate sanctions for those faculty members within the bounds of academic freedom and the First Amendment. So this is also creating the conditions for, again, a broad scope of punishments for faculty, whether or not they are tenured, who have been kind of deemed to have participated in what I just read. That could be firing. I don't know, you could get arrested. I mean, losing one's job at this point is honestly the least of my worries. It really is. That's the least of my worries. And one other thing that really I'll talk about this other one that's like utterly ridiculous, but it's the whistleblower reporting and protections, which is the second to last bullet point, second to last demand. The university must immediately establish procedures by which any university affiliate can report non-compliance with the reforms detailed in this letter to both university leadership and the federal government. So essentially, this, if you comply, which I guess Colombia did to a version of this, you're essentially empowering snitches. You're empowering and creating the conditions for informants at all levels of the institution who can bypass any institutionally established protocol for reporting and can go directly to the Trump administration to report anybody within the institution who can be construed as participating in activism. Activism was also in here. Activism, ideological capture, or like anti-Semitism. And I'm using all those things as scare quotes. What was it? What was it? It was about people who were activism. So it's about governance and leadership reforms. It's reducing the power held by faculty, whether tenured or untenured, and administrators more committed to activism than scholarship. So there is also this demand to essentially prevent anyone in the institution, particularly faculty, who can be deemed as as more activist than scholarly. They can be removed from committees. They can have no voting power, right? They can be absolutely isolated. So you completely isolate and strip faculty who are going to be targeted by name individually. Um, so they'll be in these positions, they'll be isolated, there'll be a list of these faculty, and then you're empowering literally, and the word affiliate is used here. You're empowering anybody who's associated with that institution, an employee, an alum, a parent, maybe, to report on those faculty or any others who might be suspected of engaging in this type of activity directly to the Trump administration. And then there's no understanding, there's no clear language as to like what the repercussions would be. Like being reported to the university is one thing, getting fired because you violated a code of conduct, the university of code of conduct as a faculty member. That's one thing. But being reported directly to the feds, that to me feels like that triggers something like the CIA or the FBI or the Department of Homeland Security or ICE or something. That's what that feels like, that. And you would be facing probably like criminal prosecution